Chapter 1. The Howl of the Herd. The Drakwald Forest seethed with life and death in equal measure. Gnarled trees twisted toward the sky like the grasping fingers of dead gods, their ancient boughs shrouding the world below in a murky half-light. The scent of decay hung thick in the air, mingling with the primal musk of the gore warband of Khorgar Bloodhorn. At the heart of this roving herd, Khorgar Bloodhorn stood atop a felled oak, his broad, muscular form outlined against the gloom. His thick, matted fur was streaked with dried blood, his curved horns adorned with the skulls of lesser creatures. His baleful red eyes swept over the braying horde of beastmen below, Ungor, Gore, and Bestigar alike, all united under his savage rule. Yet for all his strength, it was not conquest or hunger that drove him forward tonight. It was something deeper, something primal, a force that called to him, gnawing at the edge of his consciousness. Beside him, the Bray shaman Malgar Blacktongue hunched low, muttering in a garbled mixture of dark tongue and guttural beast speech. The old shaman's body was marked with ritual scars, his flesh a latticework of runes carved in sacred filth. A ragged cowl of flayed human skin covered his shoulders, and his left eye, milky and useless, stared blankly into the void. Malgar had seen visions in the entrails of a still-living Empire scout. He had seen a great power buried beneath the roots of the world, something that pulsed and whispered in the deep places of the forest, something old and hungry. "The earth rots beneath us, Wargar," Malgar rasped, his breath fetid with death. "The dark heart beats once more." Garzug snorted, stamping a cloven hoof. "Where, shaman? Where do the gods command us to tread?" Malgar pointed a gnarled finger toward the horizon, where the trees grew denser, their tangled roots forming an unnatural barrier of living wood and shadow. "The shrine of the weakling god, the place where men grovel to Ta'al, praying for their wretched crops to flourish. There lies the power we seek." A growl rippled through the warband. The name Tal was a curse to the beastmen, a god of order and balance, a thing of man's making, and thus a thing to be torn down. Garzug grinned, his fangs glinting. "Then we shall tear it apart," he growled. "We shall rip the bones from the earth and claim this power for the true children of chaos." The herd bellowed as one, a deafening roar that shook the trees and sent the carrion birds wheeling into the sky. The Drakwald itself seemed to tremble at their fury, and deep within the blackened earth, something stirred. Something waiting. Something hungry. Chapter 2. The Desecrated Shrine. The shrine lay nestled within a shallow valley, its weathered stone walls barely visible beneath a thick layer of moss and ivy. Twisted roots coiled around the foundations, as if the very forest sought to reclaim what had been built in defiance of its will. The scent of damp earth mixed with the distant acrid bite of burning timber, the warband had already set fire to the wooden watchtower that once stood guard over this place. A great stone effigy of Ta'al, the so-called Father of Beasts, loomed over the clearing, his crude likeness carved into the trunk of an ancient oak. The god's visage was cracked and time-worn, but even in ruin it exuded a quiet strength, a defiance that enraged Khorgar Bloodhorn's warband. They would remedy that soon enough. The Bestigar, his muscular frame slick with sweat and blood, raised a stolen Empire war axe and brought it crashing against the effigy's face. Stones splintered, chunks of weathered rock tumbling to the ground. But the visage remained largely intact. "Tear it down," bellowed Garzug, his guttural voice carrying over the snarls and brays of his gathered horde. With renewed fervor, the beastmen threw themselves at the idol, hacking and hammering until the once sacred face of Ta'al crumbled to dust. With a final, furious push, the ancient oak toppled, crashing into the dirt with a resounding boom. A chorus of triumphant howls rose into the night air. The monks had locked themselves inside the shrine when the warband descended upon them. Their feeble wooden barricades had done nothing to stop the blood-maddened beasts from forcing their way through. The heavy wooden doors lay in splintered ruin, their iron reinforcements torn asunder by brutal claws and weapons chipped from old bone. Inside the shrine was modest, its simple wooden pews and hand-carved altar exuding an air of long-forgotten reverence. The walls were decorated with faded murals depicting deer, bears, and wolves in harmony, watched over by the ever-watchful eye of their god. Such weakness. The monks, 7 in total, cowered near the altar, their feeble robes drenched in sweat. Some clutched wooden staffs, others held small knives, pathetic weapons against the warband that had come to tear their faith from their bones. One, an elderly priest with a tangled gray beard, stepped forward, shaking but resolute. His frail hands gripped a carved oak staff, its head adorned with the symbol of Taal. "You are not welcome here, creatures of the dark woods." His voice trembled, but he held firm. "Leave this place, or suffer the wrath of the father of beasts." The warband's laughter filled the chamber, cruel, guttural, mocking. Argo stalked forward, towering over the old man. His breath was hot and reeked of raw meat and decay. He stared into the priest's defiant, unblinking eyes, then reached out with one massive clawed hand. The priest barely had time to gasp before Garzug gripped his head and lifted him off the ground like a child's rag doll. "Your god is dead," Garzug snarled. With a single sickening crunch, he squeezed, bone and brain matter exploding between his fingers like a rotten fruit. The monks screamed, their fragile minds shattered as their spiritual leader was reduced to a twitching, headless corpse. Then the slaughter began. A young monk, barely more than a boy, turned to run, but a bestigar with notched horns caught him by the throat and hurled him into a stone pillar. His skull split open like an overripe melon, red and gray spilling across the shrine's sacred floor. Another monk, desperate, lunged at Malgar Blacktongue, his knife aimed at the Bray shaman's throat. Malgar snarled, his milky eye burning with malice, and uttered a single guttural incantation. The monk screamed, his flesh boiling away from his bones, until only a shriveled husk collapsed onto the ground. The others fared no better, hacked apart, trampled underhoof, gutted like pigs. Within moments, the once holy shrine was a charnel house. The sacred murals now dripped with fresh blood, the once peaceful silence replaced with the gurgling moans of the dying. Garzug surveyed the carnage, exhaling in satisfaction. Tael's last servants in this wretched place were dead. But the work was not yet done. Malgar approached the altar, his crooked staff tapping against the blood-slick floor. He could feel it, even through the air thick with copper and decay, something buried beneath the stone, something ancient, pulsing, hungry. "The dark heart beats beneath us," he muttered, his ruined lips curling into a twisted grin. "Then we will rip it free," Garzug rumbled. With a mighty swing, a bestigor smashed his axe into the altar, sending cracks splintering across the stone surface. Another blow, then another, until at last the altar collapsed, revealing a shadowy hollow beneath the shrine. Inside, wrapped in the roots of the forest itself, was the artifact. It was a great obsidian stone, jagged and black as a starless void, but its core pulsed with a sickly green glow. Wired stone, raw and unrefined. The air hummed with energy, making the beastman's fur stand on end. Malgar's breath hitched, his ruined eye weeping blood as he stared upon the relic's malevolent glow. "Chaos, take me," he whispered, reaching forward with trembling fingers. The moment his clawed hand made contact, a shockwave of dark energy blasted outward, extinguishing the shrine's torches in a sudden, suffocating darkness. The beastmen brayed in alarm, some stumbling, others gripping their weapons as an unnatural wind howled through the desecrated temple. The whispers began. Low, insidious, slithering through their minds like serpents in the dark. Feed us, wake us, release us. Malgar laughed, deep and guttural, his cracked lips curling into a rictus of mad glee. "The gods have given us a gift," he rasped, lifting the wyrdstone-tainted relic high above his head. Garzuk's breath quickened. He could feel it too, power, raw and unshackled, beckoning him to slaughter, to bloodshed, to endless carnage. He turned to his warband, his eyes burning with unnatural light. "Tonight," he growled, raising his gore-drenched axe, "we carve our names into the flesh of the world." The Drakwald trembled with the howls of the warband, and somewhere, deep within the obsidian heart of the artifact, something ancient stirred in its slumber. Chapter 3. The Call of the Artifact. The Drakwald pulsed with unease. A storm had not come, yet the air hung thick with tension, the sky above the treetops shrouded in unnatural darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a pack of wolves howled, but their song was off, distorted, pained, as though they sensed something that should not be. The warband of Khorgar Bloodhorn gathered around the wyrdstone-tainted relic, its pulsing glow casting sickly green light upon their twisted forms. The beasts of chaos had seen many horrors in their time, mutations, war, the touch of daemons, but this thing was different. It hummed, it breathed. Even without touching it, they could feel its presence worming into their bones, gnawing at their minds, urging them toward murderous fury. A low growl rippled through the horde. Gorse clenched their crude axes and rusted swords, their hooves pawing at the dirt, bodies tensing as their blood boiled with rage. Ungors, the smallest and weakest among them, twitched and frothed, some seizing violently, their eyes rolling white with madness. A Bestiger, his massive body rippling with muscle, turned suddenly and buried his axe into the skull of a nearby Gor without a word. The victim barely had time to bleat before his head split apart, brain matter splattering onto the roots below. Another snapped his jagged teeth into the throat of a fellow warrior, tearing flesh and tendon free with a sickening rip. The warband collapsed into chaos, brother tearing brother, their bestial instincts overwhelmed by a murderous hunger. Only one among them did not succumb to the frenzy. Malgar Blacktongue stood at the center of the carnage, his ruined eye oozing black ichor, his lips curled in a knowing smirk. He had seen this before, not in life but in visions, and his blood sang with excitement. "The dark heart calls to us," he murmured. Malgar raised his crooked staff, the runes carved into his flesh burning with a dull, eerie light. It was time. The ritual begins. Garzuk Bloodhorn watched as Malgar stepped forward, ignoring the slaughter unfolding around him. The Bray shaman knelt beside the wyrdstone-infused relic, laying his clawed hands upon its obsidian surface. The moment he touched it, his body seized. A pulse of dark energy shot through his veins, his muscles locking, his mind flooded with visions, worlds of fire and ruin, shadows writhing in the void, a great hunger reaching through time and space. But he did not fight it. He welcomed it. His lips curled, and he began to chant in a language not meant for mortal tongues. Muzakwatun, Arejulkas, Gulkor Velzan. The words crawled through the air like living things, twisting and curling like black serpents. The warband, still locked in their frenzied bloodletting, suddenly froze mid-slaughter. Their heads snapped toward Malgar, nostrils flaring, eyes wide with terror and reverence. Something was coming. The awakening. The relic's pulse quickened, its glow intensifying. The forest groaned, trees bending away as though repelled by its presence. The ground beneath them cracked. roots curling away like dying fingers. And then a shockwave exploded outward, hurling beastmen off their hooves. A deafening wail tore through the air, a sound that was not of this world, a cry of agony and hunger and rage woven into one. Garzug was thrown backward, his massive body slamming into the dirt with enough force to split the earth beneath him. He snarled, shaking off the pain, his vision blurred by the swirling green light that now engulfed the relic. The warband reeled, panting, eyes wild with fear. For the first time in their wretched lives, they knew true terror. The artifact had awoken, and something had answered its call. The spectral horror. The darkness twisted, the air warping, the space above the relic tearing open like rotted flesh. A form began to emerge, a towering figure clad in blackened armor, its jagged silhouette wreathed in shadow. Its face was hidden behind a deathly helm, its eyes hollow voids, its body semi-corporeal, flickering between existence and nothingness. The moment its clawed feet touched the ground, reality screamed. Every beastman in the clearing fell to their knees, clutching their heads, their minds filled with an overwhelming tide of rage and despair. This thing was not a demon, nor a spirit of chaos. It was older. It was a forgotten curse, an echo of some long-dead empire, bound to the relic's power. The spectral guardian turned its faceless gaze upon the warband, and then it moved. Slaughter in the dark. The fourscore never had a chance. The spectral guardian swept forward in a blur, its massive sword carving through flesh like air. The gauze body split in two, the upper half tumbling forward, his guts spilling onto the dirt, before the lower half even realized it had been severed. The warband exploded into motion, some charging, others fleeing, but it mattered not. The guardian was death incarnate. A bestigar, larger than the others, roared and swung a great axe, but his weapon passed through the phantom warrior's chest as though striking mist. The guardian's blade, however, was not bound by such limitations. It pierced the bestigar's gut, and with a twist the creature was flayed from the inside out, his entrails spilling from the spectral wound. Unger scrambled toward the trees, only for the air itself to collapse upon them, their bodies crushed into pulped meat by some unseen force. The beastmen, creatures who had never known fear, were now prey, and the hunt had begun. The aftermath. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the guardian stopped. Its hollow gaze turned toward Malgar, who knelt before the artifact, his arms outstretched, his ruined lips muttering more of the old words. And just as it had emerged, the guardian dissolved, fading into shadows and whispers, returning to the void from whence it came. The warband gasped for breath, their ranks shattered, their minds reeling. Malgar rose, his single good eye gleaming. "We have awoken the dark heart," he rasped. He turned to Garzug, who still knelt, his body trembling from the raw power that had passed through them all. "Now, Khorgar Bloodhorn, we shall use it." Garzag's lips curled into a grin. The slaughter had only just begun. Chapter 4. The First Summoning. The Drakwald was alive with whispers. The wind slithered through the trees like a hungry serpent, carrying with it voices that were not of this world, words that had not been spoken for thousands of years, muttered in tongues long since swallowed by oblivion. At the heart of the clearing, where the ruins of the shrine to Tal lay desecrated and broken, the artifact pulsed, its wyrdstone-tainted heart beating in rhythm with something far away, yet impossibly close. The beastman warband had grown restless. After the ritual, after the shockwave that had torn through the forest and shattered the minds of weaker Ungors, a quiet had descended. A silence too deep, too unnatural. Even the carrion birds, drawn to the stench of rotting flesh and spilled bowels, refused to land near this cursed place. And then the light dimmed. The green glow of the artifact flickered. The air tightened, as if the night itself had become a clenched fist, pressing down on the warband. Something was coming. The night trembles. The Ungors were uneasy. They sat apart from the larger Gors and Bestigors, clutching their spears with trembling fingers. They were weaker, smaller, the lowest rung of the herd's brutal hierarchy, expendable, disposable, meat for the slaughter. And tonight they would learn their place once more. A strange mist began to rise from the ground, thick and cloying, curling around their hooved feet. The air hummed with a noise too low to be heard, a thrum that set their teeth on edge, made their horns ache with an unnatural pressure. One Gor, a runt with patchy fur and a jagged horn, shuddered. He turned to the others, his voice cracking. Do you feel that?" he whimpered. The others nodded, shifting uneasily, their yellowed eyes darting to the artifact, which was now vibrating on the cracked stone where the altar once stood. Then the sound came, a low echoing wail, as if some ancient throat had opened for the first time in eons, exhaling a breath of pure malice. The Ungors froze, their spines locking, their ears flattening against their skulls. A shadow spilled from the artifact, stretching outward, writhing, unfurling like a thing awakening from a 1,000-year slumber. It rose higher and higher, a towering figure taking form within the swirling dark mist. And then it stepped forward. The Guardian rises. It was colossal, easily twice the height of even the largest Bestigar. Armor blacker than the void itself encased its hulking frame, its jagged plates covered in runes long forgotten, flickering with sickly green light. Its face was hidden behind a massive helm, a twisted mockery of a knight's visage, its eye sockets black pits filled with nothing but emptiness. In one gauntleted hand, it clutched a blade far too long to be wielded by any mortal, its surface cracked and weeping with green, ghostly mist. The Ungors stood motionless, their minds refusing to accept what they were seeing. Then the thing moved, and the slaughter began. At the butchering, the first Ungor never even had time to scream. The Guardian's blade descended, cutting through flesh, bone, and earth alike. The Ungor's body fell apart in two halves, bisected from skull to groin, his guts spilling out in a steaming pile as the ground drank deep of his blood. The second tried to run. He managed 3 steps before the spectral knight lifted a gauntlet, its fingers flexing. The air collapsed inward as though some invisible hand had gripped the Ungor's chest and squeezed. A heartbeat later, his torso imploded, his ribcage shattering inward, his lungs and heart bursting like overripe fruit. His legs and arms dropped lifelessly to the ground, his body now little more than a ruined husk. The others panicked, dropping their spears, bleating in terror as they scrambled over each other, desperately trying to flee. It was no use. The Guardian moved like a wraith, its form flickering, its blade carving through the fleeing Ungors as though they were mist. One was cleaved diagonally, his upper body sliding off his lower half as his organs spilled free, steaming in the cold night air. Another was caught mid-leap. The spectral knight's gauntlet seized his throat, lifting him high. The Ungol kicked and clawed, gurgling, his bulging eyes reflecting the green glow of the entity that held him. Then the Guardian's fist clenched, and his neck snapped like dry kindling, his lifeless body tossed aside like garbage. By the time it was over, the ground was slick with gore, the corpses of the slaughtered Ungors twitching in their final moments. The Guardian stood motionless, its void black eyes scanning the clearing. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it began to fade. Its form unraveled, dispersing back into the mist, its hulking silhouette swallowed by the darkness once more. And then it was gone. The warning. The remaining beastmen, those not caught in the massacre, had watched in silence. Even Khorgar Bloodhorn, who feared nothing, had found his clawed hands gripping the hilt of his axe with white-knuckled force. Malgar exhaled slowly, his single good eye glinting with something between awe and madness. "Do you see now?" the Bray shaman rasped, his voice thick with reverence and hunger. Khorgar turned to him, his brows furrowed, his body still humming with the aftershock of raw power. Malgar took a step forward, his lips curling into something resembling a smile. "This is only the beginning." Khorgar grinned, his fangs glinting in the dim green glow of the artifact. Then he turned to his horde, his eyes burning with feral joy. "We have been given a gift," he growled, voice thick with bloodlust, "and we will use it." The beastmen howled, the sound tearing through the forest like a war drum, a signal to all who dwelled in the shadows. The summoning had succeeded, and soon the old world would drown in its wake. Chapter 5. The Rise of Bloodhorn. The stench of death still lingered in the clearing. The corpses of the slaughtered Ungers lay twitching, their ruined flesh steaming in the cold night air, their lifeblood soaking into the cursed earth. The warband had watched in silence, their primal minds struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The Guardian's slaughter had been effortless. The summoned horror had butchered the Ungors like meat unworthy of existence, as though they were fleas crushed under a titan's heel. For the first time in their savage lives, the warriors of chaos knew fear, and Garzug knew opportunity. The challenge. The warband had not yet crowned him as their undisputed warlord. He had power, he had blood on his hands, but so did others. Khorgar One-Eye, a towering Bestiger, had long been a rival, stronger, broader than even Garzug. His hide was scarred from countless battles, his left eye nothing but a hollow pit, lost in a skirmish against Midland swordsmen years before. Khorgar stepped forward now, his axe gripped tight in his clawed hands, his chest heaving with the tension of the moment. His deep voice rumbled, cutting through the low murmurs of the herd. "You would have us bow to you, Garzug?" he sneered, his tusked mouth curling in a mocking grin. His one remaining eye gleamed in the greenish glow of the artifact. "You think a trick of the wyrdstone makes you mighty?" The warband snorted and brayed, their hunger for conflict rising. The hierarchy of the beastmen was brutal and absolute. Domination was earned through slaughter, and weakness was devoured without mercy. Garzug bared his fangs, stepping closer, his grip tightening on his massive cleaver, a war axe forged from scavenged steel and raw fury. "The artifact is power," he growled, his voice thick with uncompromising certainty. "Power I will wield." Khorgar laughed, deep and guttural. "Then wield it, whelp. If you can." The challenge was issued. There would be no turning back. The duel of beasts. The warband howled, forming a loose circle of bodies, their hunger for bloodshed pulsing through their veins. The night trembled with their savage anticipation. Khorgar struck first. With incredible speed he lunged, swinging his rusted, notched axe in a blow meant to cleave Garzug's head from his shoulders. Garzug ducked, the wind of the axe's passing roaring above his horns, missing by a fraction of an inch. He lashed out, his clawed foot slamming into Khorgar's ribs, sending the larger Bestiger stumbling backward. The crowd of beastmen bellowed, bloodlust rising. Khorgar snarled, his exposed teeth dripping with saliva, his one eye burning with fury. He came again, this time lower, trying to bury his horns into Garzug's gut. Garzug pivoted, grabbing Khorgar's thick, scarred wrist, twisting hard. Bones cracked and Khorgar roared in pain, his attack falling apart as his arm buckled. Seizing the moment, Garzug drove his forehead forward, his curved horns smashing into Khorgar's face with a sickening crunch. Teeth shattered. Blood sprayed across the dirt. The warband howled, their chants rising like a storm, fists pounding against chests, hooves stamping the ground in a thunderous rhythm. But Khorgar was not beaten yet. With a furious bellow, he slammed his shoulder into Garzug's chest, sending him reeling backward. The larger Bestigor leapt, bringing his axe down in a brutal arc, aiming to split Garzug's skull in two. Garzug caught the strike, his cleaver meeting the axe mid-air, metal screaming against metal. For a heartbeat they were locked together, their eyes mere inches apart, their breath hot with rage. Then Garzug acted. He twisted his cleaver, wrenching Karzak's axe off course. The move left Karzak open, and Garzug took his prize. With a snarl of victory, he plunged his cleaver into Karzak's belly, forcing the blade deep, until the hilt kissed torn flesh. Karzak gasped, his one eye going wide. Garzug ripped the weapon free, and Karzak's intestines spilled from his ruined abdomen, slithering onto the ground like fat, writhing serpents. The Bestigor staggered, clutching his guts, his strength failing. Garzug stepped forward, towering over his dying rival. He grabbed Karzak's horns, yanking his head forward, and with one final, brutal swing, he brought his cleaver down, severing Karzak's thick neck in a single stroke. The headless body crumpled, twitching in the dirt. Garzug held up the severed head, blood dripping from the gory stump, and let loose a triumphant roar. The warband echoed his cry, their howls of fury and worship shaking the very earth. The coronation of blood. Malgar stepped forward, his twisted grin wide, his eyes burning with foul delight. "You are no longer just Garzug," the Bray shaman rasped, his voice slithering into the night air. "You are Khorgar Bloodhorn." The name rippled through the warband, the echoes of it taking root in their savage minds, cementing Garzug's place among the annals of monstrous legend. Khorgar raised his axe, his fangs bared in a victorious snarl. "We have the power to call forth death itself," he bellowed, his voice shaking with violent purpose. The warband stamped, roared, howled, their bodies humming with newfound purpose. Malgar stepped beside Khorgar, his hand resting on the pulsing relic, his lips curling into a vile sneer. "This is only the first taste," he whispered. "We will summon more. We will call forth an army of the damned." Khorgar turned his gaze to the artifact, his breath heavy, his blood still singing with the high of the kill. An army of spectral horrors? Yes, the old world would tremble before the call of Bloodhorn. Chapter 6. The Gathering Storm. The Drakwald Forest had always been a place of darkness, a festering wound in the heart of the Empire, a breeding ground for monstrosities that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the moment to tear into the world of men. But now, something was different. The wind carried whispers, not just the usual guttural growls of beastmen roaming the woods, or the distant wailing of lost souls dragged into the abyss. This was something older, something hungry. And the warherds could feel it. The call of the Wyrdstone. It began with the Bray shaman. They had felt the shift in the winds of magic, the pulse of something deep beneath the roots of the world. Those who gazed into the gore-streaked entrails of their sacrifices saw the same terrible vision, a pulsing black heart, veins of sickly green wyrdstone twisting through it, beating with the rhythm of war. The omen was unmistakable. Something had awakened, and the beastmen came. The warherds were scattered things, fragments of a long-dead empire, fractured and brutal, bound together only by violence, hunger, and blood. But when the scent of power filled the air, the herds converged. From the blighted hills of Midland, a herd of twisting, mutated horrors emerged, led by the bloated Doombal Khorgar the Bloodied, his hide covered in scars, his teeth blackened from the flesh of his own kind. From the marshes where man dared not tread came the children of the Rotwood, a warband of filthy, plague-ridden goatkin, their bodies riddled with boils and rot, their very presence souring the earth beneath them. And from the northernmost reaches of Drakwald, beyond the ruins of once proud empire villages, came the war herd of Garzug the Crowfather, a shaman king whose horns dripped with sacrificial gore, his followers clad in the flayed skins of men and elves alike. Each had heard the same tale, carried by the dying screams of those who had fled too late. The Khorgar Bloodhorn wields the dark heart. He calls forth the ghosts of the long dead. The artifact beats with the will of the gods. The warherds gather. Khorgar Bloodhorn stood atop a fallen tree, his massive axe resting against his shoulder, his yellowed fangs bared in a knowing sneer. Below him, his warband swelled, the bodies of fresh arrivals mixing with his own. The air stank of sweat, blood, and raw anticipation. The newcomers snarled and pawed at the ground, their hooves kicking up dirt, their clawed hands twitching toward the weapons strapped to their backs. They had not come here to bow easily. They had come to test the so-called Bloodhorn. Malgar Blacktongue, standing at Khorgar's side, let out a low, guttural chuckle. His milky eye wept black ichor, his lips curling into a knowing grin. "They will fight you," he rasped. "They will try to take the relic for themselves." Khorgar snorted, his breath hot with anticipation. "Then let them try." Blood on the soil. The first to step forward was a Bestigar, larger than most, his horns tipped with iron caps, his torso thick with knotted scars. He carried a two-handed axe, its edge chipped from countless battles. He did not waste time with words. With a thunderous roar he charged, his hooves tearing into the dirt, his axe arcing downward in a killing stroke. Khorgar sidestepped, his own axe rising to meet the attack. The two weapons clashed, sending a shockwave of force through the air. The challenger snarled, his muscles rippling as he pressed forward, trying to overpower Khorgar. But Khorgar was waiting for it. With a twist of his grip, he let his foe's weight carry him too far, stepping aside and burying his knee into the Bestigar's gut. The beastman staggered, gasping, but Khorgar did not give him time to recover. His axe came down, carving deep into the challenger's exposed neck, severing half his throat in a single stroke. The Bestigar collapsed, his body twitching, his blood pouring onto the roots below. The warband bellowed in approval. But more would come. Another leapt forward, this one wielding a serrated blade, his face painted in crude blood markings. He lunged, trying to gut Khorgar from below. Khorgar caught his wrist, twisted and drove his forehead into the rival's skull. The impact shattered bone, sending the challenger reeling, dazed. In the next moment, Khorgar's claws were inside his throat, and he ripped it free in a shower of gore. The winds of magic shift. As one by one the challengers fell, the air itself began to change. The winds of magic, which had hung thick and pregnant with malice, began to twist, spiraling toward the clearing where the artifact pulsed with unnatural light. Even the warbands that had not yet challenged Khorgar could feel it. The forest quivered, and beyond the trees, in the lands of man, others had noticed the shift as well. The eyes of the Empire. Far to the south, in a small town near the edges of Midland, a group of witch hunters gathered in a candle-lit chamber. Their leader, Captain Reinhard von Drexler, frowned as he read the latest reports. Towns had been razed overnight. Villages that had stood for generations were now smoking husks, their people slaughtered in ways that defied reason. And the worst part? The bodies that hadn't been butchered had been left untouched, their eyes open, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror, their hearts burst inside their chests, as though something had reached inside and squeezed the life from them without ever breaking their skin. Reinhard set the parchment down. His hands tightened around the hilt of his silver-forged sword. "This is no ordinary warherd," he murmured, his jaw tightening. "Something foul is at work here." The witch hunters nodded in grim agreement. "We march at dawn. The storm is coming." Back in the Drakwald, Khorgar stood atop the mound of fresh corpses, his chest heaving, his clawed hands dripping with blood. He turned to Malgar, his eyes burning with unholy light. The artifact pulsed behind them, its glow brighter than ever, its whispers growing louder. More will come, Malgar rasped. More than just beastmen. The men of the Empire will feel this power. Khorgar's lips curled into a savage grin. Then let them come, he growled. His warband howled in the darkness, their voices rising like thunder. The Drakwald had changed. The storm had begun. Chapter 7. The Burning of Unterwald. The night was still, the moon a sickle of pale silver hanging above the Drakwald. Beneath its cold glow the hamlet of Unterwald lay in ignorant slumber, nestled between the towering black pines that loomed over its wooden palisade. The peasants slept soundly, their dreams filled with the struggles of their meager existence, oblivious to the storm of death descending upon them. The warband of Khorgar Bloodhorn moved through the shadows, their eyes burning with hunger, their bodies tense with anticipation. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed fur, dried gore, and the foul musk of the herd, but the wind carried it away, keeping the villagers blind to their doom, for now. At the head of the pack, Khorgar Bloodhorn stood motionless, the pulsing wyrdstone-tainted artifact clutched in his clawed hands. The green light within it flickered, casting a sickly glow upon his twisted features, illuminating the ritual scars and bloodied fangs that marked him as the master of this horde. Beside him, the Bray shaman, Malgar Blacktongue, whispered in dark tongues, his voice a slithering whisper that sent unnatural shivers crawling down the spines of the surrounding gores and bestigors. His single good eye gleamed, while the milky ruin of his other dripped with black ichor, a sign of the corrupting power now flowing through his veins. "It thirsts, Bloodhorn," Malgar rasped, clutching his gnarled staff. "The dark heart hungers for the death of men. It must drink." Khorgar's massive chest heaved, his breath a deep, guttural snort. He turned to his warriors, raising the artifact high above his horned head. "Burn it all, slaughter them in the name of the true gods." A deafening roar erupted from the warband, and the attack began. The slaughter begins. The first beastmen hit the wooden gates like a tidal wave of muscle and fury. The primitive barricades splintered under the impact of war axes and crude battering rams, and within moments the entrance to Unterwald lay in ruins, the gaps spilling forth a flood of monstrous forms. The first man to die was a watchman, still half asleep, his hand just reaching for the rusty bell rope to sound the alarm. A bestigor's axe cleaved through his spine, severing him from shoulder to gut, spilling his intestines across the dirt-packed road. His partner barely had time to scream before a clawed hand gripped his face, lifting him off the ground. The gore holding him squeezed, and with a wet crunch, his skull caved inward, brain matter oozing between thick fingers. The alarm never rang. Unterwald's doom. The hamlet awoke in terror. Men and women stumbled from their homes, some grabbing pitchforks, others simply running, but it made no difference. A black-furred minotaur smashed through a cottage, goring a screaming woman on its massive horns. She thrashed, her body spitted like a doll, until with a grunt, the beast hurled her corpse through a window, where she landed in the arms of her husband. A young boy no older than 10 winters ran blindly into the street, his tiny hands clutching a wooden toy sword. His eyes were wide with terror as he saw the monstrous horde swarming through his village. Igor spotted him. There was no hesitation. With a snarl, the creature snatched the boy up, gripping him by his frail little throat. His tiny legs kicked uselessly in the air as the gore squeezed. His neck snapped like a twig. His corpse was tossed aside, already forgotten. The houses of Unterwald burned, the roaring flames climbing high into the black sky, filling the night with thick plumes of acrid smoke. The air reeked of charred flesh, and above the din of battle, the agonized screams of the dying rang out like a cursed melody, the first summoning in war. And then Khorgar lifted the artifact once more. The moment his clawed fingers tightened around its obsidian surface, the relic pulsed violently, the glow within it intensifying. A shockwave of unnatural energy blasted outward, sending ash and embers swirling into the night sky. The very air grew heavy, thick with malice and death, and the wind carried voices, whispers of the forgotten, echoes of agony. And then, from the shadows of the burning village, they came. Towering figures, clad in blackened armor, their faces hidden behind empty helms, their forms shifting between the realm of the living and the dead. The spectral guardians had returned. The nearest group of villagers saw them first. They screamed and ran, but it was pointless. The first spectral warrior moved like a shadow, its blade cleaving effortlessly through the fleeing mortals, leaving no wounds, no torn flesh, only husks, their bodies collapsing, their eyes wide in silent horror, as though their very souls had been torn from within. But the guardians did not discriminate. A Ghor, still mad with slaughter, turned at the wrong moment, his eyes widening as the spectral blade plunged into his gut. He shuddered violently, his breath leaving in ragged gasps, as his flesh withered, his bones turning to brittle dust. His lifeless husk collapsed, disintegrating before he even had time to scream. Khorgar watched, his grin widening. "They kill all, even our own," Malgar's voice rasped, his ruined lips twisting in amusement. Khorgar simply snorted, his eyes never leaving the spectral warriors as they butchered man and beastmen alike. "This is power," he growled. "True power." The last of the villagers lay dead, the hamlet of Unival nothing but smoldering ruin. The flames reflected in the eyes of the warband, their faces twisted in rapture and madness. But as the last scream faded, the guardians turned. They did not fade into the mist this time. They remained. Their empty helms slowly shifted, turning toward Khorgar Bloodhorn. And though they had no voices, no words, no mortal tongues, he heard them speak. And for the first time in his savage life, a sliver of uncertainty crept into his heart. The warband had summoned something they did not yet understand. And the dead did not serve for free. Chapter 8. The Hunters of Midland. The cold winds of Midland carried the stench of charred wood, burned flesh, and death as Captain Reinhard von Drexler led his grim procession into the ruins of Unterwald. The dawn had barely begun to break over the ashen wasteland, the light anemic and feeble, unable to dispel the shadows left behind by whatever monstrosity had swept through the hamlet. The Midland Knights of the White Wolf rode in tight formation, their massive war horses snorting, their armor etched with the scars of countless battles. Each knight bore the icon of Ulrich, the Howling Wolf, and their faces were grim, their gauntlets clenching the hilts of their weapons as they beheld the devastation before them. At the heart of their number, the witch hunters of Sigmar strode forward, their long leather coats billowing in the chill wind. Their wide-brimmed hats cast deep shadows over their gaunt faces, their inquisitorial eyes scanning the remains of Unterwald with the cold, unyielding scrutiny of those accustomed to judging the damned. Captain Reinhard von Drexler rode at the head of the column, his face a mask of quiet fury. He had seen the aftermath of Beastman raids before, but this was different. The stench of evil. The village gates had been reduced to splinters, the crude wooden palisade shattered as if struck by a storm. Blackened beams jutted from the ground like broken bones, while the charred corpses of villagers lay strewn across the dirt, some huddled together, others collapsed mid-light. The crows had arrived before them. They gorged themselves on the dead, their black eyes gleaming with malicious intelligence as they plucked flesh from brittle bone. One of the witch hunters, a wiry man named Karl Hess, dismounted and moved toward the nearest corpse, a woman, clutching the remains of a burned child in her arms. He knelt, brushing aside the thin layer of soot, revealing something worse. Her face was frozen in an expression of terror, her mouth stretched in a silent scream, her eyes glassy and wide, but her body bore no visible wounds. Karl cursed under his breath. This was not the work of simple beastmen, he muttered, his voice thick with unease. Reinhard dismounted, his cloak billowing behind him, the sigil of Sigmar gleaming against his chest. He strode forward, his boots crunching over cinders, his hand resting on the pommel of his longsword. They were taken by something else, he said grimly, something unnatural. A gust of wind kicked up a swirl of ash, revealing strange markings scorched into the dirt. Runes of a forgotten age, twisted into corruptive spirals, thrummed with latent power. One of the knights of the White Wolf, Sir Ulbricht, muttered a prayer to Ulrich, making a warding sign over his chest. "Chaos is at work here, Captain," he said, his voice low. Reinhard nodded, his jaw tightening. "It always is. The spectral remains." The knights and witch hunters spread through the ruins, searching for any signs of survivors, but they found only corpses and whispers of the unnatural. Then they found the bones. At first they appeared to be piles of ash, scattered in the streets and along the outskirts of the village. But as the sunlight fell upon them, they saw the truth. The blackened remains of warriors clad in ancient armor, their weapons still clutched in skeletal fingers, their helmets twisted into deathly grimaces. Sir Ulbricht frowned, prodding one with the tip of his warhammer. The bones collapsed into dust, disintegrating at the slightest touch. "Witchcraft," Hess murmured. "No," Karl Hess corrected, his voice quiet but firm. "Something worse." Then the runestone was found. One of the younger hunters, a recruit named Marcus Feigl, was the first to notice it. Half buried beneath the ruined remains of Unterwald's shrine, a single obsidian shard pulsed with an eerie green light, its jagged edges humming with malevolent energy. As he reached for it, a sudden shockwave of dark magic lashed out. Marcus screamed, his body lifting off the ground, his veins blackening as raw chaos surged through his flesh. His eyes rolled back, his mouth opening in a silent, anguished wail, and then, just as suddenly, the energy fled from him, his corpse collapsing into a heap of withered skin and brittle bones. The witch hunters recoiled, hands flying to their pistols and swords. Reinhard, however, simply watched. His expression barely changed. Without hesitation, he drew his silver-forged blade, stepped forward, and drove the weapon into the shard, shattering it into 1,000 glowing fragments. The runes screamed as they died, and the light faded, leaving only silence. "This is wyrdstone corruption, Captain," Calhan said, his voice tense. "Whatever happened here was not just a beastman raid. This is something else." Reinhard nodded, his mind already piecing together the truth. "A warherd passed through here," he said, his voice cold and measured. "But they were not alone. They have something powerful, something that can summon things that should not be walking this world. The warband that had raised Unterwald was not just another pack of savage beastmen. They had a weapon, and if they were not stopped, the Empire would burn." A decision made. Reinhard turned to his men, his gaze steely and unflinching. "This warherd must be hunted down," he said. "We ride at sundown." The knights of the White Wolf gripped their warhammers, their faces hard with resolve. The witch hunters loaded their pistols, their expressions grim with certainty. The hunt was on, and Khorgar Bloodhorn would die screaming. Chapter 9. The Pact of the Horned Ones. The ground trembled beneath the weight of hoof and claw, the very earth seeming to quake as the beast horde of Khorgar the Bloodied emerged from the twisted depths of Drakwald. Their guttural snorts and bellows filled the air, mingling with the stench of rotting flesh, charred wood, and wet fur. The Doombo led them, a living battering ram of flesh and fury. Khorgar the Bloodied was a mountain of muscle, taller than even the largest Vestigor, his massive horns caked in the dried remnants of 100 kills. His clawed hands gripped an iron-plated axe, a weapon so large that it seemed forged for a giant, yet he wielded it as easily as a butcher's knife. His red-rimmed eyes burned with hatred and hunger, and his body bore the scars of countless battles, fresh and old. He was not merely another warlord. He was destruction incarnate. And now he had come for the dark heart. The challenge. The Warherd of Khorgar Bloodhorn stood on high ground, overlooking the bloody clearing where Dr Wald had once stood. The relic pulsed upon an altar of bones, its sickly green glow twisting the air around it, warping reality itself. Khorgar Bloodhorn had known this day would come. Power drew hunger. Power drew predators. And there was no greater predator in the Drakwald than Khorgar the Bloodied. Khorgar stepped forward, his massive cleaver resting upon his shoulder, his breath slow and measured. His eyes met Khorgar's, and for a moment there was only silence. Then the Doomba laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that sent birds screeching from the trees, as if even the forest itself recoiled in terror. "Bloodhorn!" Khorgar bellowed, his voice like thunder. "You clutch at power beyond your station. You think to command the dark heart, but you are a pup among wolves." Khorgar did not move. The warherd grunted and stamped, some snarling in agreement, others watching in anticipation. There could be only one master. Khorgar lifted his gore-stained axe, pointing it toward the relic. "That power belongs to me," he snarled. "You will submit, or you will die." Khorgar finally grinned, his yellowed fangs gleaming. He cracked his neck, rolling his shoulders, his clawed fingers flexing around the grip of his cleaver. "Then come and take it." The herd erupted into frenzied howls, pounding their hooves into the dirt, their blood singing for carnage. The challenge was made. The battle of beasts. Khorgar charged first. The ground shook beneath his massive frame, trees groaning as his bulk tore through the clearing like a boulder hurled by a god. His axe swung wide, a monstrous arc of iron and death, aiming to cleave Khorgar in two. Khorgar sidestepped, but not fast enough. The edge of Khorgar's weapon scraped against his ribs, tearing a deep gash into his side, black blood spurting onto the dirt. The Doombull was fast, far faster than something that size had any right to be. Khorgar snarled, his muscles tightening as the pain burned through him. Good. He welcomed it. He struck back, his cleaver hacking toward Khorgar's exposed flank, but the Minotaur twisted, catching the attack with his axe handle, sending sparks flying. Then he lunged. His massive horns slammed into Khorgar's chest, lifting him off the ground, sending him hurtling backward into a heap of bones and broken weapons. The warherd bellowed, half cheering, half watching in tense silence. Khorgar coughed, tasting blood in his mouth. He wiped it away with the back of his clawed hand, then rose to his hooves once more. Khorgar snorted in amusement, rolling his massive shoulders. Is this all the mighty Bloodhorn has to offer? Khorgar grinned again, this time wider, something feral glinting in his eyes. You think I fight alone? Khorgar's nostrils flared, his brows furrowing. And then the artifact pulsed. A shockwave of unnatural energy erupted from the bone altar, sending dust and embers swirling into the air. The wind howled, the very trees shaking, and, from the shadows beyond the warherd, they began to appear. The spectral guardians had arrived. The wrath of the dead. The first phantom warrior materialized behind Khorgar, its massive blackened blade rising high, its helm an empty abyss of void-black hatred. The Doombull sensed it too late. The blade swung downward, carving deep into Khorgar's back, not through flesh and bone but through essence itself, a wound that bled no blood, yet made the Minotaur stagger, his roar turning from fury to agony. More came, one to his left, another to his right, their deathless blades slashing, cutting, tearing into something unseen, unmaking something beyond mortal comprehension. Khorgar roared in blind rage, his axe swinging wildly, but his weapon found nothing. His blade passed through the phantoms like mist, their forms shifting like smoke, only to solidify once more and strike him again and again. The warherd watched in horror. They had seen these things kill men before, but now they killed their own. Khorgar stumbled, his massive form heaving, his eyes rolling with rage, confusion, and pain. He turned to Khorgar, panting, his breath ragged, his wounds glowing with spectral corruption. This is no strength of yours," he snarled, spitting black ichor onto the dirt. Khorgar tilted his head. "Yet it is you who is dying." With a final thunderous roar, Khorgar charged once more, his hooves tearing into the blood-stained dirt, his axe raised high. Khorgar did not move. The spectral warriors did it for him. They surged forward, their deathless forms merging into one, an unstoppable wave of hatred and steel. Khorgar disappeared within it. For a brief moment, all that could be heard was his agonized bellow. Then, silence. When the phantoms receded, there was nothing left of Khorgar but his horns, lying scorched and broken upon the ground. Khorgar turned to the warherd. "Who leads you now?" he growled. The answer came without hesitation. The herd knelt. And the Drakwald belonged to Khorgar Bloodhorn. Chapter 10. The Horns of Chaos. The Drakwald trembled beneath the weight of so many hooves. The night was thick with blood musk, the stench of feral rage and slaughter clinging to the gnarled trees like an omen of ruin. 2 warherds now stood in the clearing, Khorgar Bloodhorn's warband, fierce and swollen with their leader's newfound power, and the remnants of Khorgar the Bloodied's broken warriors. The minotaurs of Khorgar's warherd snorted and pawed at the dirt, their nostrils flaring, their massive frames twitching with uncertainty. They had witnessed the impossible. Their mighty leader, the unstoppable Doombul, had been unmade, his body consumed by spectral guardians that answered to Bloodhorn. And yet they did not kneel. Not yet. Minotaurs did not bow easily. The warherd fractures. A roar of defiance split the night. One of Khorgar's remaining lieutenants, a towering minotaur named Rajgar Bonegrinder, stepped forward, gripping a war axe that dripped with the blood of past victories. His red eyes burned with primal fury, his thick arms corded with muscle, his jagged teeth gritted in hatred. "Bloodhorn!" he bellowed, spittle flying from his thick, scarred lips. "Khorgar was strong. You are only a wretched thing hiding behind magic. You wield the power of the dead, but what are you without it?" The warherd stamped their hooves, braying and snarling, the air thick with challenge. Khorgar grinned, his yellowed fangs gleaming in the artifact's sickly green glow. He could feel its pulsing hunger, the whispers of the spectral guardian still lingering at the edges of reality, waiting for his command. "You want to see?" Khorgar rasped. He stepped down from the bone altar, gripping his massive cleaver, its edge still wet with Khorgar's blood. His gaze locked onto Rajgar. "Then come and die." The jewel of beasts. Rajgar's hooves tore into the ground as he charged, his massive horns lowered, his axe raised high. The sheer weight of him, the ferocity of his charge would have shattered a warhorse, split a man in half. But Khorgar was waiting. At the last moment, Khorgar sidestepped, his cleaver slashing outward in a brutal arc. The blade bit deep into Rajgar's side, carving a jagged trench through thick hide and muscle, but the Minotaur barely flinched. Rajgar whipped around, his massive fists swinging. One caught Khorgar across the jaw, sending him reeling backward, the force of the blow dislocating his shoulder with a sickening pop. Khorgar spat blood, his vision flashing red with pain, but he did not falter. Rajgar pressed the attack, bringing his war axe down in a killing blow, but Khorgar rolled to the side, the impact shattering the earth where he had stood just a heartbeat. Then Khorgar moved like a predator. With a snarl, he slammed his clawed hand into his dislocated shoulder, forcing it back into place with a sickening crack. The pain was blinding, but it fueled him. And now he had seen the truth. Razgar was strong, but he was flesh and bone. He could be bled. He could be killed. Khorgar lunged forward, feinting left before twisting right, his cleaver flashing in the dark. The weapon sank deep into Razgar's thigh, severing muscle and tendon, forcing the Minotaur to stumble. He roared in fury, swinging wildly, but Khorgar was already behind him. With a snarl of triumph, he leapt onto Razgar's back, his cleaver burying itself into the Minotaur's spine. The blade bit deep, severing nerves and bone, and Razgar's legs buckled, his body collapsing under its own monstrous weight. Khorgar wrenched his cleaver free, and as Razgar gasped his final, shuddering breath, he drove his hoof into the back of the Minotaur's skull, crushing it like rotten fruit. The warherd fell silent. The challenge was over, and Khorgar stood victorious. The will of the relic, but it was not enough. The artifact still pulsed, its whispers gnawing at his mind, filling him with visions of slaughter, of endless war, of power beyond the flesh. His blood still sang with the thrill of the kill, but it was not enough. Not yet. He turned to Malgar Blacktongue, who stood at the edge of the clearing, his milky eye gleaming, his lips twisted in an eager sneer. "Summon them, brave shaman," Khorgar growled. "Let them see who leads them now." Malgar let out a low, guttural chuckle, stepping toward the artifact, his clawed hands stretching toward its blackened surface. The moment he touched it, reality twisted. The air grew heavy, charged with unnatural power. The trees groaned as if in agony, their branches warping and cracking. The earth split open, veins of wyrdstone energy slithering through the soil like serpents of green fire. And then the dead came forth. The spectral guardians manifested, their towering forms wreathed in darkness, their hollow helms staring down upon the gathered warherd. The beastmen recoiled, even the Minotaurs shrinking away, their instincts screaming at them to flee. But Khorgar stepped forward. "You see them, you fear them, but they serve me," his voice thundered through the clearing. "I am Bloodhorn. I am the breaker of herds. I command the dead. I command you." The warherd was silent. And then, one by one, they bowed. The Minotaurs fell to their knees, their massive forms shaking with submission. The Gors and Bestigers slammed their weapons into the dirt, roaring their loyalty to their new master. The warherd was his now, but the artifact still pulsed. It was hungry, and as Khorgar stood among his growing army, watching the phantom warriors fade back into the void, he felt it. The power was his, but it was unstable. It wanted more than slaughter. It wanted everything. And deep within his savage heart, Khorgar wondered, had he claimed the relic, or had it claimed him?